Okay, I hope everyone is well. So last time we met, we started off doing the executive, and essentially what I asked you to do was find out what the key parts of the executive are. We then had to look up a government department of your choice, find out who some of the key people are within that government department. What did I ask you to do? So a little bit of work on the main functions of the executive, and then that stuff on the prerogative powers. So just to quickly go over some of those points, not going to go through everything. I'll just do some areas where people typically get a little bit unstuck, want some explanation. Civil servants. So within every department, you have civil servants. They basically they're politically neutral, so they work for whoever is the minister or the government at the time. They don't all change when you have a Labour or a Conservative government. They are politically neutral, and they basically do all the donkey work, if you like. So they're the ones who will write up the policies in detail, make it legal. They'll also be involved in implementing the policies as well. They also have an important job in kind of helping the minister or government make the policy decisions. They'll do research into the initiatives which the party wants, who's going to form the government, that type of stuff. They also kind of prepare for different scenarios and different governments as well. So when the time of the general election comes around, they'll look at the Labour manifesto and the Conservative manifesto, and they'll begin to make plans amongst themselves about how they're going to initiate the agenda of either party if they were to get in. So that's what civil servants are. You get very well paid. The top civil servant gets about 150, 200,000 pounds a year, something like that. More than the Prime Minister gets, actually. It is a long-term career. People join the civil service, have to do special exams to join the civil service, and then you can move up the system from there. Okay, we're going to meet some civil. Well, I'm going to meet them. We're going to see some civil servants in action today and the relationship with ministers in a video I want you to watch. Okay, the structure of government department. I assume you quite easily found one. Foreign Office, Education Department, whatever. Okay, the three main roles. So hopefully these are fairly straightforward. So one role of the executive is to propose legislation, i.e. introduce laws into Parliament. As we already know from looking at Parliament, the executive dominates Parliament, they dominate the agenda and stuff like that. So most of the laws that get introduced into Parliament, they're proposed by the executive. They propose a budget, so every year they've got to introduce a budget into Parliament. Again, this is normally done by the Treasury, which is run by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, sort out taxes and all that kind of stuff. And of course, you've got to have a vote on the budget every year, otherwise things will stop, basically. So you've got to approve taxes and all that kind of stuff. And then making policy decisions. It's a little bit like proposing legislation. It's the bit that goes beforehand. So it's setting the agenda for the government, initiating new ideas. The government might have certain goals, and then the executive then have to decide, how they're going to write that up into legal speak to pass what laws to pass those things. So making policy decisions is quite important. I suppose I should have put one on here, actually, which I haven't done. I suppose another role of the executive to deal with crises. Again, they're normally quite short term, but obviously we're dealing with quite a big one at the moment. So again, I suppose a role for the executive in some ways is to deal with a crisis, because they do come along from time to time. Okay, now the executive has got a certain number of prerogative powers, and from the textbook I asked you to jot them down in a diagram form. He says trying to find them himself. Now, some of these prerogative powers are held, they're all held by the executive. Some of them, though, are specifically held by the Prime Minister. And if I remember right, he says trying to find it. In the textbook, they've coloured those in a slightly different colour, I think. That is another one that's done that. So you've got these prerogative powers. So prerogative powers are powers really which are held by the Queen or the monarch, which is kind of given, that's very kind of, isn't it, to the Prime Minister or the executive. Often it's the Prime Minister, and this provides a lot of power for the Prime Minister. So you look at these powers, so you've got things like awarding honours. This is called patronage. So you can, things like CBEs and knighthoods and MBEs and all that kind of jazz, for want of a better word. Well, the Prime Minister is very much involved in that system. He recommends people to the Queen to officially make into a knight or an MBE or whatever that is. It's quite an important power because patronage can really kind of be quite powerful because people quite often want to get these things. People put that recognition. So you might get some MPs who might quite like to be made a knight or whatever it happens to be, and so that might help them support the Prime Minister's agenda. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head, and I can't do it, but there are quite a few members of Parliament who are made into knights and stuff like that. So quite a few sirs. Well, Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was knighted. I think it might have been under Cameron's time. We often do it from their own party and as a way of supporting them. Okay, so awarding honours is really important. Okay, declaring war. In the UK, there's a convention that you don't need to go to Parliament to declare war. So it's a power held by the monarch, which it gives to the Prime Minister because the Queen is technically head of the military. So, for example, famously, when Britain declared war against Nazi Germany in 1939, there was no act of Parliament to authorise that. The Prime Minister said the deadline for declare war on Germany is going to be on the 1st of September 1939, unless the Germans pull out of Poland. Nazi Germany didn't pull out of Poland, so he then said, right, we're now at war with Germany. There's no thing through Parliament or anything like that. Recently, though, there's been a convention that Prime Ministers now do go to Parliament. So Tony Blair, for example, before the Iraq War, went to Parliament to get authorisation for using the military in Iraq. David Cameron, before in Syria as well, he actually was defeated as well on this, which is unusual for foreign policy stuff. He wanted to use military force in Syria to deal with Mr. Assad. So there has become a bit of a convention of late that Prime Ministers do go to Parliament before they declare war. Although, technically they don't need to. It is a prerogative power. I suppose you need a little bit of flexibility, but again, think about those essays where you need to think about things from Unit 1. You could, if you're talking about these powers, you could say classical liberals, and even modern liberals like John Locke, or modern liberals like Rawls and these sorts of people, they don't like these prerogative powers because there's not much accountability. If you can go to war without going to Parliament, then who's to question that decision, etc., etc. There's lots of other ones as well. So you've got signing treaties. Again, that's often done with the Prime Minister. Foreign secretaries sometimes might be involved in that. Taking action to maintain order in case of emergency. That's quite a rare one, but again, there might be an emergency situation where perhaps more drastic action is needed. Grant and withdraw passports. Again, that's quite a rarely used one. That'd be one which the Home Secretary would be more involved in, I suppose. Granting legal pardons. Again, that's the one I imagine the Home Secretary is more involved in, but it is a prerogative power. And then one which the Prime Minister uses all the time, appointing ministers and sacking ministers and other senior office holders. So again, the Prime Minister, and that's part of his patronage as well, appointing people into his government. Are you going to behave? Are you going to vote with me all these times? Well, if you do, there might well be a job for you in government. How do you fancy being minister for this or minister for that? So all these prerogative powers, it's up to you to decide which ones you think are the most significant and why. Again, there's no right or wrong answer to that one. And then the third dot there was, do you think that prerogative powers should be given to Parliament? So this is oh, hello, Zengi. What do you think, Zengi? You want your tea, don't you? That's what you want. So there has been some, for example, there was a prerogative power that the Prime Minister can decide when he wants a general election to be called. That's a power that has gone to Parliament with the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. Gordon Brown was quite keen to make it legal that you had to go to Parliament before war. Military force was used abroad in warfare. They never actually got round to actually doing it. Okay, Zane, you're trying to scroll down here. Yeah, go and say hello to the big children. Okay, we then got other. Okay, looks like you've got Zengi speaking to you, not me. You then got other powers of the executive. Again, these are quite straightforward. The one sometimes do get a bit stuck on is secondary legislation. This is normally where there's a law, but it might need a few amendments making to it, a few changes being made to it. And rather than passing a whole new law on all the first readings and second readings, blah, 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 the minister will basically just do it, essentially. Or he might, and usually what they do, they normally inform Parliament, they normally do a little thing when they say, we're going to amend the 1948 blah, blah, blah Act from this to this. But there's not a great deal of scrutiny of them. It's one of those odd things, isn't it? In some ways, you might think, well, it makes perfect sense. If you only want to make a few small changes to something, or even to get rid of a bit of a law, because laws are great big long things, you might think, well, actually, that bit's no longer needed. We don't do that anymore in this country. Or, it makes sense that, I don't know, I can't think of something top of my head, but we might need to make a slight amendment or something. Perhaps a bill had a figure in it for how much something should cost or something like that, and they want to increase it a bit more next year or something like that. You might say it makes perfect sense why we have to go through Parliament to do all those clauses. But there have been some quite significant things which have been done this way with very minimum scrutiny. Things like fracking in national parks, trying to get oil from national parks. University maintenance grants as well was done through this way. And there has been some controversy over this in 2017 as well regarding the repeal bill about Brexit. So again, find out about this. It's largely to do with there's all these laws which mention the word EU in them, and of course they all need to be got rid of. Do you have to go to Parliament to every single act of Parliament which mentions the word European Union in it, or can we just assume that those laws no longer needed those sentences? So secondary legislation very much involved there. Right, so in terms of new bits, the next one's got a picture of the Chancellor. I changed this, I suddenly remember before I put it on the system. What do government ministers do? Now, I don't think it's actually in the textbook anywhere, a nice diagram. I'll bore you about what the ministers do. Normally in class I do this as a bit of a brainstorm. So thinking about what the ministers do, well, one job is that they look after and represent their department. So, for example, the Chancellor, who we've got a picture of here, he's technically in charge of the Treasury, the Finance Department. Now, there might be 30,000 civil servants who work in that department. He's kind of in charge of them all. He's a bit like a head teacher, I suppose, in terms of all the teachers and stuff. Obviously, he doesn't know them all, doesn't meet them all, but he is normally in charge of that department. His job is to look after that department as well, and he's supposed to represent that department. All ministers are supposed to represent their departments at like cabinet meetings and in government. So if, I don't know, Prime Minister is wanting to attack a government department for some reason, or if there's some kind of conflict between one minister's department and another minister's department, then those ministers are supposed to kind of look after their department. So that's one job. Okay, looking after and representing their department. One criticism, by the way, which prime ministers often have of government ministers, is that they kind of get captured by their departments. So rather than representing the prime minister's wishes in their department, they end up becoming the poodle of the department. If that makes sense. Other jobs, they're accountable to Parliament for their department. So if something goes wrong in their government department, they are technically accountable for it. It's called ministerial responsibility. We'll do about this in a future lesson. So there's been some cases in the past of civil servants in departments like losing people's data by mistake, like leaving a disk on a train and things like that, which is very embarrassing for the minister because he or she is accountable to Parliament for that department and what they do right and wrong. And of course, think about those departmental select committees and stuff. It's government ministers who are answering questions about their department. Other things to do, they initiate policy ideas. So Prime Minister might say to them, when they appoint them as a minister, say, well done, I've appointed to be the Home Secretary or whatever it is, I'd like to please to cut immigration. Okay, and then it's up to the minister then to work out the details and initiate how they're going to do that and what it should be. Sometimes ministers might act more, depends on the Prime Minister, I suppose, might act more on their kind of initiative and come to the Prime Minister and say, look, I've been thinking, Prime Minister, that we need to reform schools and education in this way, and this is how I think we should do it. Michael Gove, when he was Education Secretary under David Cameron, I would say he was very much that way. I think David Cameron was quite broad brush, I'd like to see education reformed, but it was actually Michael Gove who actually did a lot of the detail, working with his civil servants in the education department to make that. So initiating policy ideas, implementing ideas as well on laws. So if a law has gone through Parliament, it's the job of the civil servants in that department, the minister in charge to kind of spearhead that's implementation. So again, just think about Michael Gove and those education reforms. He was very much behind writing up those laws and coming up with the ideas. And then his next stage, if you like, of his job as Education Secretary was implementing them, pushing them through Parliament, pushing that law through Parliament, trying to make sure that Ofsted followed certain criteria for this, trying to make sure the exam board and all the different organisations changed their exam specifications to meet what he wanted education to be like. So implementing policy takes a lot of effort and because a lot of people are resistant to some of these changes, so he's got to really kind of push these things through. Other jobs, can't read my own writing now. I'll come back to that one. Help government make decisions at cabinet as well. So obviously they've got a wider role because they represent the government as well. So obviously at a cabinet meeting, if you're like the Home Secretary or something, you've also got to help the rest of the cabinet make decisions on stuff that might not be on your particular expertise, your particular area. But again, it's helping the decision making take place. I've also put in here dealing with crises. We see this under Boris Johnson in particular, haven't we? Especially with him being absent. It's been more his ministers who've been very much involved in that, and they've been working kind of collectively, haven't they? So Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, has been on that podium most days talking about PPE and all the rest of it. But you've also had the Chancellor dealing with the financial elements of the crisis. He's popped up, hasn't he, quite a few times and done stuff. And you've had the local government minister as well. He's been up and about. So he's helping deal with crises. I suppose as part of that, supporting the Prime Minister as well. So they're expected to go on like the media and publicise what the government are wanting to do and trying to do answering questions on things like Newsnight and the 6 o'clock news and Radio 4's Today programme, all that type of stuff. I still can't read right with the one. Direction to... I don't know. Okay, so they're kind of the jobs which ministers do. So there's quite a few of them. So if you ever become a government minister, you've got to keep all those plates spinning, if you like. Looking after your department, being accountable to Parliament for your department, initiating policy ideas, implementing policy ideas, helping the government make decisions at cabinet level, representing the government in front of the media, dealing with crises. So there's all those different plates you've got to be spinning, as well as, of course, being an MP representing your constituents, because all these MPs represent constituencies. They've got all the same problems which other MPs face. There's a nice programme on, unfortunately you can't get it on iPlayer and stuff, or Channel 4's version. They did one about, it's after Joe Cox was murdered, and they did a thing about MPs meeting their constituents about surgeries and stuff. And there's one where it had Nick Clegg, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, very senior government minister. One of his surgeries in Sheffield, where he was an MP, and he was answering stuff about dog poo on the streets and things like that. So they're dealing with all that as well as doing all these government stuff as well. So yeah, you can feel a little bit sorry for, well, not to get quite well paid, mind you, so that's done. Okay then, so that's the type of things they get up to. Now, what I'd then like to do is, again, this is on Teams. There's a series called The Secret World of Whitehall. It was done kind of at the back end of the Brown time of government, so it's about 2009, 2010. I think it's about that kind of period this series was made by someone called Michael Cockrell. We're going to look at some other ones that he's done. He's done quite a series of things looking at all this type of stuff. Now, what I like to do on that, it shows you, you can watch the whole thing if you like. They're all, I'll put the links on. But it's basically, what I want to do is watch the first 7 minutes of episode 3, which is called The Network. Again, feel free to watch the rest of it. There's some really good stuff on it and some really good examples you can use for things. And what this is about is the relationship between the minister and his civil servants. And it shows you Alan Johnson, who became Brown's Home Secretary, I think it was Home Secretary, working with his civil servants. Now, there's a little bit of tension sometimes between a minister and their civil servants. And the reason is that a minister's often been appointed and they're often quite keen and enthusiastic and they want to please the new Prime Minister and they want to make a bit of a splash. Civil servants have this reputation because they've been there a long time, thinking, oh God, we've got another one, and being a little bit conservative with a small c, seeing as a little bit kind of, I don't know what the word is, obstructionist is a little bit strong, but that's how they're traditionally seen. There's a really good series, by the way, it's a comedy, it was Mrs. Thatcher's favourite comedy in the 1980s called Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, and it's actually from the diaries of Anthony Crosland, a Labour minister in the 1970s, and it's about this relationship between civil servants and ministers. It's well worth watching if you've got time. You've got more than enough time. Anyway, going back to this, so you've got minister and civil servants, and what a lot of ministers do is they have special advisors, political advisors, people who are loyal to them and not the civil servants. So they'll appoint, they call them SPADs, okay, like these special advisors. They're paid for by the minister, they're not paid for by the taxpayer directly, so to speak. And what they do is that they do the political advice. So the civil service might say, oh, we're a bit sure about this, we're not sure about whatever. And this group, but they're not allowed to talk about politics so much, the civil servants, whereas these SPADs can. And they might say, well, politically, minister, this might be a good thing to do because of this. Or politically, your civil servants are probably quite right not to do that. So the first 7-8 minutes of this video is about the SPADs, basically. So what I'd like to do, and it shows you Alan Johnson, there's Ken Clarke as well, who's had lots of ministerial jobs in the past. There's the real political expert, conscious expert, someone called Peter Hennessy, and again he's on this video as well. So let's do the first 7 minutes. Feel free to watch the rest and take notes, that's perfectly fine and perfectly good. Once you've done that, what I'd then like to do finally is what are the informal powers of the Prime Minister? Okay, now in Britain, the Prime Minister, because we don't have a codified constitution, there's nowhere where there's a job description for the Prime Minister. So most of the countries with a codified constitution, if you look at the American one next year, it'll say the powers of the president are, and it lists all his powers, essentially, and then it says what he can't do. Well, in Britain, we don't do that. We kind of just muddled along. He's got some prerogative powers, he's kind of got some other bits of powers added on here and there. Okay, I suppose most of his formal powers are those prerogative powers, essentially. But he does have a number of other powers as well, and functions. So what I want you to do is on the diagram, there's a picture of Boris Johnson in the middle, and around the outside I've put on what the formal and informal functions and powers of the Prime Minister are. So you've got appointing, dismissing ministers, managing, chairing the cabinet. Some of the, what I want you to do is explain what each one means. Okay, some of them are quite straightforward, like dismissing ministers and appointing ministers. Well, you probably can't put that in other words than what the title is. And then try and put some examples in for some of these. Any examples of the Prime Minister appointing people and getting rid of people? Actually, someone's resigned from the government today, so there's one for you. Managing and chairing the cabinet. So find out how often the cabinet meet and what that role of chairing is. Direction of government policy. This is one for the bottom right. Providing national leadership. I think in the current COVID crisis, you'll probably be able to get a good example there, I would have thought. So what I'd like to do is to do that diagram. So that is for, where are we on? Thursday, isn't it? Thursday, Friday when I do the next video. So if you can get that done, that'll be great. Because all you have to do basically is watch the video and do that there. There's not any particular bits in the book on them, but a lot of them are common sense on that. In the Lynch book, they got a bit about the powers of the Prime Minister on page 122, 123, and how powerful the Prime Minister is. So again, for some extra reading and stuff, have a flick through that as well. Okay, right, I'll speak to you at the end of the week.